Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Few topics are more controversial than that of reparations for the descendants of slaves. So I thought I'd get a guest on to talk to us about it. He's a philosophy professor, director of philosophy, politics, and economics at Georgia State University. He also writes on such topics as toleration, civil discourse, and applied ethics. Professor Andrew Jason Cohen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's just jump right into this. I read an article that you wrote in support of reparations. So tell us, why are descendants of slaves owed money?
Well, the case that I made in the article that was on Discourse magazine is fairly simple and straightforward. I'd say it's the easiest way to think about it is by comparison to a tort case, a lawsuit. If somebody does you harm, you sue them. You sue them to make you whole. It's very simple, very straightforward. The case that I made in that article is simply this. The federal government of the United States did harm to people, slaves, and then later in other ways as well, but we don't have to go into all those details. And the federal government, as the perpetrator of a crime that did harm, still exists. And the crime itself basically still exists. That is to say, there are still people today that are harmed by the activity that took place, even though it took place, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, whatever it was, right? So there's still victims and there's still a perpetrator. The federal government should make those people whole as if it were a lawsuit.
So basically, the idea is that the descendants of slaves that were brought here from Africa are still suffering the repercussions from the institution of slavery. That institution was facilitated by the federal government. Therefore, the federal government owes them the money, correct?
Correct.
And you also said in the article that it's not the citizens that owe slaves money, descendants of slaves money, but rather
That's
the federal
exactly right.
government.
Right. So we're not talking about slaveholders repaying slaves. The slaveholders don't exist anymore. So we do away with all of that.
Yeah.
And it's just the federal government as the perpetrator.
Okay. The problem I have with that is that the federal government doesn't have any money. It only has money that it gets from the people, right? So to say that the federal government owes the descendants of slaves money is to say that I owe them money.
No, it's to say that you have a separate responsibility to the government, whatever that responsibility is. This is no different than a school or a church or a business, right? Schools, churches, business takes on debts. If they owe money to a particular person, if they have to make somebody whole because of a lawsuit, that money comes from somewhere. In a corporation, it comes from the stockholders. You don't say the corporation has no money, it's the stockholders' money. It's the same thing with this. We are citizens of the United States. We have to pay the debts, or we have to pay the government the taxes. Now, granted, I think you and I probably agree that we should be paying a whole lot less in taxes than we do and paying for a whole lot less services than we do. But the government has a debt. It has to pay for that debt. It has to pay for that debt in some way. I'm perfectly happy if the government can sell off enough of its property to pay the debt in that way. If that's not enough, then it comes from taxes.
Okay. The difference, though, between a corporation and the government is that the corporation doesn't get its money by compulsion. It doesn't use force to get money. The federal government does. So you're essentially talking about the federal government robbing some people to pay off the descendants of slaves.
I'm not sure that's accurate for a couple of reasons. Let's say you're unhappy with, I don't know, your homeowners association,
Okay.
right? And the homeowners association wants to spend money on whatever it might be. I live in a neighborhood with a association that spends money on lots of things that I think it ought not spend money on, right? But I have to pay what we call assessments. It's another word for tax, if you ask me, right? I have to pay that assessment to the association. The association then uses that money to pay for these things, many of which I think we should not be paying for. It's exactly analogous to what the government does. It pays for things that I don't think we ought to pay for. I think we ought not pay for a whole lot of military stuff that we pay for. I think we ought not pay for uh, all sorts of things. We don't have to go into all the details, right? But it does, right? And I don't have a choice in that matter. I wish I did, right? I wish when I filled out my tax forms, I can say, use my money for this, this, and this, but not these other things. I don't have that right to do that. And I don't have that right to do that with the HOA. Now, you might say, but the HOA is voluntary. You move there voluntarily. This is true, right? But to get out of paying that, I have to go through a lot of hassles. I have to sell my home. I have to move. I have to hire movers, et cetera, et cetera. To get out of paying the government, I have to do the same thing. I have to get a passport. I have to go overseas. I have to go to another country, right? It's exactly analogous. You might say, but the government has the force of the gun. The same thing ends up being true for all these other things. If I just decide not to pay my HOA, eventually they take me to court, right? And that gets backed up in the same way, right? I can get thrown out of my house because the sheriff will come with guns and take me out of my house. It's exactly the same situation. Maybe it's a little more direct with the government. Maybe the threat is a little bit more obvious to people like you and I. Most people don't actually see that threat the way you and I do, right? Most people just think I pay my taxes because I have to.
Mhm.
Not much of a difference.
I have to confess, I've never owned a home, so I don't know much about homeowners associations. However, if is it by virtue of moving to a neighborhood that I have to, like, if I buy a house in a given neighborhood, I have to belong to the homeowners association?
No, it depends on homeowners associations are particular. They're their own particular beasts. Most neighborhoods, you don't have a homeowners associate. Actually, I don't know if that's true or not anymore. Homeowners associations seem to be growing in
Well,
popularity.
if they're there, do I have to join if I want to live in the neighborhood?
Yes.
Okay, well, then I would say it's the same thing. You're just talking about another injustice. That doesn't justify the government doing it. It only tells me that they're wrong for doing it. If they can compel me to do things against my will, then that's an unjust situation. So just to say, well, they do it so the government can do it, that doesn't fly for me.
Right. So at the end of the day, what you have to rely on, I think, is the claim that there is no such thing as a legitimate government, right? And
No, hold on one second. No, what I
go
would
ahead.
say is there's no such thing as a legitimate government that uses force to fund it. If you had a government that was voluntarily funded, I would say that's just. But a government that relies on the use of force, I would say no, it's not just.
Right. So one standard way that governments are considered legitimate is if they are fully consensual, right? If we consent to the government's activities, those activities are then legitimate. I'm not so sure that's a great way to go. There are lots of problems with it. I do think it's a theoretical possibility. I also think uh, outside of certain circles, most people think that the US government is legitimate in that way. Most people think that the citizens of the United States government do, in fact, agree to live by its rules, right? And that article was really aimed at those people,
Okay.
right? To talk to people, to just put it bluntly, to talk to uh, other libertarians and anarchists or minarchists, that is to say, libertarians of either
Mm-hmm.
the anarchist or minarchist sort, would require a whole host of arguments about the legitimacy of government. Totally agree with that. That article wasn't meant to do that. I think that would
Okay.
take us pretty far afield. But in talking to the average person, most people don't question whether or not the government has a right to use taxation to pay for weapons, to pay for interest on student loans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. So basically, what you're saying is this is conditional. If you accept that the American government is a just system that you voluntarily take part in, then reparations make sense.
I'd rather just say if you think the government is legitimate, period,
Okay,
then yes.
legitimate. Okay.
Uh, And I said something about this, right? Rejecting the claim that we ought to pay our taxes to cover the costs of the reparations uh, is tantamount to saying we ought to be able to reject all of the international treaties that the United States government has signed over the last couple of hundred years, right? Again, if you think the government's not legitimate in the first place, you might have a question about all those treaties as well. But the average person, again, thinks those things fly.
Okay, so you say that because the government has taken on these debts, or rather because they've committed, I guess, a tort, is how you would describe it, because you're talking about basically a civil wrong.
Right.
Because they've done this, they now owe a debt to the descendants of slaves. So the problem is the government is already $33 trillion in debt.
Yeah.
So if you say, well, they can
Yeah.
sell off federal lands, which I'm all for reparations, well, you still are going to have $33 trillion in debt.
Yeah.
People that are going to say, well, what about me?
Right.
So why is this debt more important than all the others?
Yeah, I'm not sure it is, right? I mean, I think
Oh,
that's a
fair enough.
really hard question. What should be paid for first? I don't know. So I actually have a post going up on my blog, Pro Social Libertarians. I think I said it for Monday, uh, basically saying the following. I worry a lot about growing the government. I also worry a lot about shrinking the government too quickly. I think we ought to shrink government. I think that's really clear. The government, and I mean this at all levels, I think the federal government, state governments, municipal governments, international governance organizations, I think they've all taken on more tasks, more responsibilities than they ought to. And so I think all of them ought to be made smaller. But I worry about making them small quickly because I think doing that can be as destabilizing as growing the government. And I think we have to recognize that. So I think, yeah, I don't know what the most important debts are that have to be paid. That's a huge question, right? But I think we have to start figuring out a way to settle those debts, I would say, in as destabilizing a way as possible. I think it's clear there is a moral debt to descendants of slaves. How to repay them, when to repay them, how quickly to repay them, those are huge, difficult questions.
In the article, you talked about how social science tells us that the descendants of slaves would be better off today had their ancestors come here voluntarily
Right,
rather than by being kidnapped and brought here, right?
right,
To me, the counterfactual doesn't work. And here's why: the odds that absent slavery, all the factors would have come together so that the actual descendants of slaves that are here today would still exist, the odds against that are astronomical.
right.
So to say they'd be better off is just false, because in all likelihood they wouldn't even
They wouldn't exist.
exist.
Right, right. So what you're talking about is the non-identity problem, and it's huge, right? Absolutely huge. And I agree. Right? I think it's very clear. Absent the institution of slavery, uh, the people that we're talking about wouldn't exist. I also think, though, that absent the institution of slavery, you and I wouldn't exist, right? The
True.
whole world would be vastly different,
I agree.
right? So I think the question is, what's the right counterfactual? Again, huge question. I think we know certain things, though. Here's what we know. We know slavery existed. We know the federal government was more than just complicit in slavery. We know that slavery had a huge impact on the development or failure to develop of Africa, the entire continent and all the countries therein, and then thus all the people therein. We know that it had a great impact on the development of the rest of the world as well. And in particular, we'll just talk about the United States of America, right? And so I think what we have to think about is, what would the situation be absent that entire institution, again, of which the United States federal government is more than just complicit in, right? It had an active part in that institution. Uh, and I think what we have to say is, okay, absent that, what would have happened? Really hard to say. Social science suggests pretty clearly that African Americans who are descended from slaves would have had very different lives if they exist at all, right? And it says very clearly that we would have had very different lives, and the entire world would have been very different. The best you can do, I think, is consider what the world would have been like without the institution, what the world is like with the institution having taken place, with it having existed. Make that comparison as best you can. When you do that, I think it's pretty clear that the federal government did in fact act in a way that caused harms and harms that still exist.
Okay. To say there's harms, right? You have to talk about a comparative standard. So what's the proper comparison? To say that African Americans, for instance, are generally speaking in an underdeveloped state or they're worse off, the question becomes worse off as compared to whom? Do you compare them to white Americans, to Asian Americans, to all other Americans, to people in other countries? Because compared to the vast majority of the world, I would think they're actually doing pretty well. Years ago, I saw a study that said that if you were to take the African Americans and have them and consider them as a country, they would have been, I think, like the 11th richest country on the planet.
Hmm.
So how do we measure harm in that case?
Yeah, so I don't know about the details about the 11th riches, but
I don't know. It was a long time ago too, so
yeah,
it's likely
but
changed, but I'm sure they're still doing
yeah,
relatively
and the
well.
general point is right. The poorest Americans are still better off than people in other countries that are far poorer, right? That's all totally clear. Um, I've actually done a lot of work on the nature of harm. And I would say harm is a wrongful setting back of an individual's interests, right? Does that have to actually be comparative? I don't actually think you need to compare it with other people at all, right? You just look at whether or not the person who is claiming to have been harmed has had their interests set back. On that standard, right, and defending that as the definition of harm would take a lot of work, but I've written extensively about that. Once you take that view of harm on, what you say is you could do something like the counterfactual again, or you could just say, well, look, take this individual African American person or this individual group of African American people and say, have their interests been set back, and have they been set back wrongfully? And there, I think the answer again is yes. Ultimately, probably I am relying on the counterfactual. That is to say, if the institution didn't take place and these people were here, they would have had their interests forwarded in a way that they don't now, which is to say, essentially, that slavery and its aftermath caused a great, I don't want to say divide, but it caused great problems, right? Every other group that came to the United States was able to integrate more easily, right? So when Irish people came over, they were treated very badly. When Italian people came over, they were treated very badly, but they were able to integrate. One thing that we see is that African Americans haven't been able to integrate as well. And that is at least in part because of the institution of slavery, right? So Frederick Douglass thought that by this time, if I remember this correctly, he thought by this time we'd all be mixed together, right? There wouldn't be blacks and whites. It would just be we'd all be mixed together. There'd be intermarriages, et cetera, et cetera. What we actually have seen is that there are these intermarriages between Irish and non-Irish, between Italian and non-Italian, but much less between African Americans and Caucasian Americans. If we saw more of that intermingling, we'd have much less of the social stratification we have that leaves African Americans with their interests set back. And that, goes in all sorts of ways, from, the institution of redlining that was officially illegal since, sorry, I won't remember the dates. I'm thinking it was the 1970s sometimes, but we know it existed until into the 2010s even, and other sorts of things. Those sorts of problems left African Americans unable to do the sorts of things that they would have been able to do absent those institutions, all of which again have a history tied to slavery in the United States.
I agree with you about the injustices. I also agree with you that the impact is still occurring. There's one problem I have is with the counterfactual, because to rely on it, I think, is a disaster for this reason. If you're in a civil case in court, you've got to prove your case with a preponderance of the evidence, right? There has to be more than a 50% chance that you've been harmed or that your case has been made. So if you make the argument and you say, okay, my argument is they would have been better off if their ancestors came here voluntarily. There's no way you're proving that to the 50% standard, because the overwhelming odds are they wouldn't exist at all. So you can't do that. So, okay, if you say, were you actually subject to the injustice of slavery? No. Were you actually subject to Jim Crow? Some cases would be yes. And then you have to say, well, if I'm a defense attorney, or rather, yeah, if I'm the defense attorney for the federal government, I say, okay, are they better off? How has the United States benefited them? There's been certainly things that have been harmful to them, redlining, Jim Crow, but on whole, they're better off than the rest of much of the rest of the
Okay,
world because of
right.
the institutions of America.
Agreed. But let me ask you this.
Sure.
Let's say I see you on the street and I like, there's Michael. I can't stand that guy. And I run into you with my car.
You better get in line.
But so I run into you with my car,
Sure.
and I don't know, I cause you, I don't know, I break your leg or something like this, right? And I feel guilty about this. And so I leave you, I don't know, I give you $50,000, right? You're breaking your leg or my breaking your leg. Doesn't cost you $50,000, right? You go to the hospital, let's say it cost you $20,000 to get it taken care of. You don't actually lose any work, et cetera, et cetera. So I've left you better off. Do we then say you haven't been harmed? That seems like a clear mistake to me. We say, in fact, that you were harmed, and I tried to compensate you for it. I maybe tried to make you whole, but we do say that I made you harmed, right? And I think the same thing is true here. What we can say is, yes, living in the United States benefited people, benefits really pretty much everybody. The only group of people that I think I'd say it doesn't benefit are perhaps homeless children. But pretty much everybody gets benefited by living in the United States. But that doesn't mean that they're not the victims of harm, right? And the fact that you're benefited, and this is the case that I made isn't a good one. So let me give you a slightly improved case here. I run you over, I break your leg. My friend Joe comes over, feels bad about what I did. He gives you the $50,000, right? You're better off than you were before, even though I harmed you. I take it you still have a case against me, right? The fact that Joe gave you $50,000 shouldn't matter about what I do. In the same way, the fact that people are better off having lived in the United States doesn't change the fact that the United States still owes them a debt.
Okay. The problem with the analogy is you're still living in that case. You've caused me a direct harm. So if
Right.
somebody else decides to compensate is irrelevant, I can still come directly for you. In this case, you're talking about people whose disadvantage and benefits are collateral or far removed from the initial event. And the people, the actual human beings that caused the harm no longer exist. So now we tie it to the organization of the federal government. And you say the federal government still exists and it caused the harm. But
Right.
the federal government has also provided the benefits of protection in a free society. So here's my question though. This is
I don't
I
even
think
think you believe that at the end of the
no,
day.
no, I don't. What I think is this is that the federal government's awful. Like I think it's terrible. However, the federal government is supposed to be limited by the Constitution, by the Bill of Rights. Those things, those institutions have benefited African Americans, right? And the federal government is the enforcer of those things. So the federal government, if you're going to argue it harmed, you can't then take away the fact that the federal government has also fought wars. It provides police, it provides subsidies, and it also has provided a large amount of welfare programs and that sort of thing, which both whites and blacks have benefited from. But I want to go back to your example. Suppose you're on your way to an important job as you're driving your car. And because of that, you have to be there at a certain time or you don't get the job. On your way, you run me down and you permanently injure me to the point where I can no longer work. You, however, go and you go get a fantastic job that's going to set you up. You're great for life. You now have money you can leave to your children. Meanwhile, I can't do any of those things. I'm disabled. My kids are poor. Say it's 5 generations later now. Your family is still doing well. My family isn't. Do my ancestors then have the right to sue your ancestors? I mean, your descendants, rather? My descendants sue your descendants?
Okay, so multiple things to be said, right? The short answer to your question is, well, of course, everybody has a right to sue for anything.
No, no, I mean a right to
That's
win, though. You're right. To
right,
sue,
right,
yes. I mean, I can
right.
sue.
So will you win or not? That's the open question, right? And I think in the case that you said, probably you lose. Probably you lose pretty quickly. So I think at the end of the day, much of the case for reparations is going to rely on the social science. I am not, at the end of the day, a social scientist. I'm a philosopher, right? So what I laid out was a moral case. And I think what you would need to do, your descendants would need to get economists, sociologists, et cetera, to do the empirical work to figure out whether or not there's a tie between my running you over and causing your problems, right? Where we agree that I harmed you. That's clear, right? The
Yes.
social scientists would have to do the work to figure out whether or not that resulted in my descendants doing well and your descendants doing badly. And if the answer to that is yes, then I would think that your descendants would have a case and they would win, right? And I think that's exactly parallel to the reparations case. If the social science says that the actions of the federal government from 100 years ago or what have you have a direct impact on the way African Americans descended from slaves who are today doing less well off because of that institution, then they have a case. It's as simple as that, right? And I think the social science suggests that is in fact the way it is. Again, not my specialty though, right? I'm not a social scientist. I looked at some of the evidence. I was persuaded by the evidence. But if the social scientists come back at me and say, nope, you've got this all wrong, then I'll think, okay, maybe there isn't a case for it.
Okay, you mentioned that your specialty is morality, or one of your specialties as a philosopher, which actually is good because it was bringing me to my next question. Because this ultimately is a moral case that you're making. And what I want to
Right.
know is, what theory of morality are you relying on to draw the conclusions that you're drawing?
So that gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. And I don't know how far you want to go into that. I have a sort of a mixed view. Again, I don't know how far you want to go into this. There are three dominant theories of morality. There's utilitarianism, which is a form of consequentialism, which I pretty much completely reject. There's deontology, which says there are moral principles at play, one of which we might say something like moral actions must be universally applicable. And then there is what I would call eudaimonism. Some people will call it arete theory, but it's about living a good life. If I had to guess, I'm going to guess that you would endorse the third, but I'm not sure about that. I endorse some mixture of the second and third. That is to say, I think there are, in fact, universal moral principles. They're not necessarily perfectly clear. It takes a lot of work to figure out what they are. But I think in some ways they are, in fact, tied to the ability of agents to lead good lives. That's the eudaimonistic part. And I think even from that very brief synopsis of the three dominant types of moral theories, you can see that there's going to be something here, because what the United States federal government basically did in having this institution of slavery was made it impossible for slaves at the time to lead eudaimon lives, to lead good lives, we can just say. And that act that had the effect of enforcing the institution of slavery had a lasting impact, such that even today, people aren't able to lead as good lives as they could have absent that institution.
Okay, deontology, I just want to get a clarification on it real quickly. Deontological ethics is basically duty ethics, right? Now, I understand with Kant's categorical imperative, it has to be universalized so that everybody can act that way. But ultimately, it means you have to act out of duty. That you have to, that your actions have to be out of a sense of duty to behave in a certain way, whether it be
they only have moral
or
value
unjust.
of their duty. Yes, that's right.
Right. Okay. I'm an objectivist. Ultimately, I would be, I guess, if you were using classical philosophical parlance, I would be a teleological egoist, right? But ultimately, if the moral theory upon which you're relying is wrong, then the case is wrong, right?
Not necessarily.
Well, it can't be justified by those moral theories, is what I'm saying. It might be right by another moral theory,
right?
But if the moral theory you're relying on is wrong, then the case can't be justified by it.
Well, then the case would fail, but it might still be the case that
Yeah,
the
you might still be,
conclusion is right.
Yeah, the conclusion still might be correct.
Right.
Okay. In this, I'm going to have to go back to the previous where we started with, because ultimately you're saying that you cannot pay this debt that was accumulated by the federal government without the initiation of force. You have to be saying that it's okay to use the force of the federal government to compel people to pay taxes, to pay the descendants of slaves.
Not the initiation of force, the threat of the initiation of force.
To me, they're basically indistinguishable. I think if I put a gun to your head and tell me, give me your wallet, the distinction is going to be null in that case too.
For most people, that's not the case, though, right? Because most people pay their taxes without even the thought about it. So there's no, they don't even sense the threat.
But if somebody says to you or to the government, I disagree with this program, I'm not paying for it, they're going to find out real quickly that it's not voluntary. So unless the moral case can be made for the initiation of force, the moral case cannot be made for reparations.
So that might be right. I'm not sure it's right, but let's say it's right.
Mm-hmm.
If it's right, that's going to hold for everything else that the federal government does that we don't like.
I agree.
So at the end of the day, I'm like, okay, as I said before, the piece wasn't really aimed at other libertarians. I'm a libertarian, right? I think the government needs to stop doing, I don't know the percentages, like 85, 90% of what it does. The case was really meant for the average person who thinks that the United States federal government is in fact justified in doing all sorts of things that it does. If you believe that the United States federal government has a right to, I don't know, stop planes from flying, if you believe that the United States federal government has the right to bail out banks, right? All at the threat of the initiation of force. I don't think you can say it doesn't have the same right in this case, right? Now, in those cases, you compare those two cases, to me, it's obvious. Like, I don't have a good argument for this, right? I'll say this up front, but I think it's obvious that, let me put it differently. I would far rather have the government pay reparations to African Americans than bail out big banks.
I agree with you.
I probably could give a defense of that on moral grounds, but just a straight preference,
no,
better use of money.
I ultimately don't disagree. If you think that the federal government, the force of the federal government, should be providing all these other things, then you get to exclude reparations. I don't see how you get to that.
Right.
But the article that you wrote, ultimately, I would like to know. My last question: what compelled you to, or why were you interested in writing the argument? What got you interested in looking into this topic?
I don't know that I have a really good answer for this. I taught a class a number of years ago uh, where I used a great book, Should Race Matter by David Boonin at the University of Colorado. It's just a fantastic book. And there are two chapters in there where he makes the case for reparations. And as I recall correctly, he went into it fairly skeptical, uh, but ended up coming out thinking, yes, in fact, reparations were morally required. And ultimately, my article was meant to give a brief overview of what his two chapters were saying. I did it in my own way, but I think I don't really claim that my argument was particularly original. I think it really was indebted to David Boonin's work. Um, this was in my head, and I had been talking to one of the editors at Discourse magazine about various things that I might write about, and I don't know if he suggested or I suggested it, but we came up with this was one of the things that I might eventually write something about. A couple of months ago, I sat down and wrote it up, and it got delayed for various reasons having to do with my family and stuff. But there you go. So I'm not really sure what prompted it when it was prompted, to be honest.
Well, I'm glad you wrote it, because otherwise you wouldn't have been on here, unless I read something else you wrote, in which case you may have been on anyway.
Right.
Okay, Professor Cohen, where can people find you?
Well, my website is www.andrewjasoncohen.com. I'm on Twitter for the moment. I don't know how long that'll last. I'm Dr. Toleration. Uh, I'm on Facebook, and I have a Substack called prosociallibertarians.com. And that's probably where I post most of these sorts of things. prosociallibertarians.com.
Well, Professor Andrew Jason Cohen, thank you so much for being here. For now, this is the Rational Egoist. I'm Michael Liebowitz signing out. Remember, let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.